tell it to speak exactly what you're supposed to do. I'll also write it on the blackboard so everyone knows. And it has to do with the preparation of this lecture.
Sorry, is that the second assignment already? Is that second assignment already?
The third one. So until now, there were two assignments. One was proposing the topic on blackboard, and then it was the second one was taking part of the discussion here and choosing one of them. That was the vote, remember?
Yeah, that's already the
That was
second.
number 2.
Okay.
Number 3 would be over the Christmas holidays. It's going to be something small, so don't worry.
Okay.
If you want, let's put it like this. And then 4 and 5 are going to be the first 2 weeks of January. Okay? The 7th and the 14th of January, the first 2 lectures next year. They're going to be again kind of in class group work to set up the lecture on further February. So you can spread the work to your friends. Okay, this is the map I wanted to show you before, just to finish last week. Remember we talked about this Mexico Progressa program, or that is a prosperity, that's how you call it. And then I wanted to show you just this one map showing that this is a kind of a very nice example of a policy that was very successful. Was kind of rigorous evaluated from the beginning, so it was very credible, the type of positive results they were getting. And in that case, as you will see, how fast it spread as a practice across the world. So in 1997, basically there are 3 countries which have some kind of conditional cash transfer. Brazil, Bangladesh, and Mexico. And in fact, Mexico is the only one where this is really kind of a national policy. In Brazil, the map, this is a bit misleading, that there's one small program in one city. And in Bangladesh, it's also kind of small scale. So in 1997, this is what existed. And 10 years later, these are now all the countries which had a conditional cash transfer of some sort. I don't have the map, but if you go nowadays, you'll have most of Sub-Saharan Africa also, and then you have unconditional cash transfer. So basically, anti-poverty programs which just transfer cash to poor households without any conditionality attached. Yeah, that's kind of the also becoming very popular. But you see this kind of very fast policy dissemination of policy spread. Right, in 10 years.
Is there a particular reason why this has been spread in Latin America more completely, but not in other south?
Yeah. So you can think of, first of all, it's kind of, there are those regional effects which are much stronger, right? You can think of like, it's literally at the level of like, where we meet in regional organizations and so on. And then what was also the case was during this period, was the so-called pink tide in Latin America, where most countries had some sort of left-leaning type of government, and so they were cooperating a lot in this kind of innovative social policies. Although Mexico was not part of that, so it doesn't explain it all. So Mexico and Peru, for example, were not part of this pink tide, but most of the countries were. Yeah. Okay, but it's very well in passenger as you see here. Okay, then I want to show you 4 graphs on global health, because this is going to fit nicely into the main topic of today, which is going to be population. Right? The topic of today is population, demography.
Sorry? Yeah. Just for some seconds, because it's a little bit slow. Thank you.
Ja.
So as usual, there are kind of two things. One to keep in mind. One is kind of the amazing progress that has been achieved in terms of global health across the world in recent decades and centuries. And the second one is kind of where are still the main problems left to solve. And so you see here, which I guess you all kind of know, seeing the data is impressive. How life expectancy has risen across all regions, still with some inequality between regions, but across most regions, this is very, very strong increase in life expectancy. And if you compare to like periods at the onset of the Industrial Revolution or before, there's more than doubled. Now the problems which still persist, which are very, which should be very clear from this graph. This shows you the death, so absolute number of deaths by age in 2017. What is the one? So what grabs your attention in this graph?
Child mortality below 5 years old is as much as everyone between 8 and 84.
We have two big ages at which people die in the world, statistically, right? Either when they are very old. Yeah. So the top is people between 80 and 84, and then when they're very young, and they're 5. And then it should come to be clear that this, of course, it's still an individual drama, of course, but this is kind of maybe flying from kind of a sense that, you die at 95 or 85, maybe already long lives, and so on, and then eventually people, we all gonna die at some point. This is, I would say, unacceptable. This is the big. So I would say this is the big development problem that we still face in terms of global health. That there are 5 million kids below 5 who die every year. And as you'll see, well, here's kind of much more difficult to prevent those people to die at that age from terms of kind of health science. Those things we all know how to treat. Right? The kids who die under 5 in the world, they die for reasons that are completely unnecessary. Right? It's not. There are very few who wouldn't know how to treat. Most of them die for reasons that are completely avoidable. Okay. That being said, that's kind of a snapshot. The situation has improved a lot. So this is child mortality. So child mortality is always kind of a share of live births where the kids die before they reach the age of 5. And you see how in 1950, in some areas of the world, this was 20 up to 30% of all live births. Okay? So all the births in the year, 30% in parts of Africa, or Africa as a region, would not reach the age of 5. It's very, very high, dramatically high. And nowadays, it's still horrifying, but it's kind of much better in comparison to 50 years ago, but it's still unacceptable. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you. I promised you last time, this relationship between height and health. So this is the average height of men. This is only men because the data comes from military service. So that's a very nice source of data for this. Every year, those countries will have some sort of compulsory military service, and that's one data point that army generals are very interested about, how tall the soldiers are. Also as a sign of health. And so you have very good data over time, going a long time. And you see, this is for Netherlands, Germany, and France. In 1810, the average was below 170. Okay? And more or less 200 years. Look at the Netherlands, the average is about 3 years. And the only explanation for that very long-term trend is health and nutrition actually. Okay.
We have similar data for Africa? The
No.
expectation would be to be quite flat, no?
Yeah, so I think it's still growing, less so, of course. And then there are very interesting things like for India, for example, there's a huge gender gap, massive. Where you see kind of, over time, heights of boys increase much more than heights of girls in proportional terms. So you can even look at kind of, you can get kind of gender discrimination within households, in how food is shared and so on, also through those types of things. It's very cool. Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to show you. Yeah, here I have basically some. So now we know which age people are dying, and then we can look at what they are dying of. Okay? And here I just want to show you. Let me show you two things. Causes of death of children under 5. And the children, again, those are things that we know how to treat. Okay? Those are kind of mostly infectious diseases. So respiratory infections, preterm births, which are not adequately medical care. Diarrhea is a huge thing. Malaria, and so on and so forth. Okay? So those are actually, most of the things are, you wouldn't die of those things if you are born children. Okay? So the things which are really kind of very rare would be maybe like some genetic defects, neonatal disorders, those victims were maybe still not obvious, but most of the bulk of deaths are completely avoidable if healthcare is quality healthcare is available. If you go to very old people, then it's still available. Okay, so the big killer are cardiovascular diseases. So those are not infectious diseases. It's like heart attacks, things like that, and cancers. And those are things where it's kind of we're still for most of them we don't yet know very well how to treat. We're doing a lot of progress, but those are kind of things that are much more difficult. Okay. You can check the other ages in the, if you are interested, for every age group, you can check that.
I think you can close
Yeah?
it. Yes, it's fine.
Maybe I close it up.
Yes,
Sorry. Behind me? Okay, so today is on population growth, and there are 4 things in our agenda. One is kind of just describing the world population, where we are now, where is it going, how it's distributed, across regions and countries of the world. The second one is to understand the process of population growth. And then there are 2 other things, demographic transition, so think of that as kind of population growth in a long historical view, and then a very famous idea or theory about population and the relationship between population and development by Thomas Malthus, the Malthusian theory of population growth, that we should discuss and see how far it is. Okay, so again, I guess something that we're all aware of, but still the numbers are still very, very interesting, I think. It's kind of the world population as a whole and how it has evolved over time. And it's kind of exponential growth just like the graph of economic growth looks very similar, right? The idea is population grows, even if it's a relatively small rate, a couple of percentage points per year, this is an exponential process, right? So you end up, when you look at the total number of people in the world, you end up with a graph like that. Yeah? So for example, what is very striking is how fast things are. We're at the process where we're kind of reaching the peak. And so in the last 50 years, every couple of years we add another billion people of inhabitants. We're now at about 8 billion people. And the expectation you will see later is that we peak at around 11 billion people at the end of this century, and then it's slowly decreases. So that's kind of one thing that is striking, right? How fast we are adding a lot more population lately. And the other thing which strikes me always is how few people there were in what we might think is kind of the historical period. But like as late as year 0, right? For Christmas, when Jesus is born, there are 190 million people in the whole world. Right? So think about that's 2 Germans, more or less, or 2.5 Germans in the whole world. Right? And so that's crazy. That's very strange. Okay? That's kind of one of the reasons why when you read kind of historical accounts or when you see kind of GDP estimates for that year, that at first sight might seem like this is all just guessing. It's impossible to know the GDP of a country in the year 0. It is partly true, but on the other side you have to think of like there was very few going on. Okay? There was very few economic activity. There were very few people, so it's actually not so difficult to get a sense of what was going on. Okay? And so you have kind of it's this interesting trade-off for historians. The longer you get, of course, sometimes the more difficult it is. The sources and materials that survive. On the other hand, it's a kind of much smaller population that we have to study, in a sense. Okay? So when they say, I don't know. So from the archaeological records, I can get actually a very good picture of what was going on at that period. Because there was not much going on. It's kind of maybe a weird thought we should. Okay. So here is maybe the interesting thing is the rate of population growth, okay? And how that has evolved. So you can think of it in the same way as you would think of the rate of GDP growth, if you want. And so that graph shows now the two things put together. So this greenish one is the total stock of the population. And the purple, right? Purple. And is the annual rate of population growth. Okay? And so what's interesting is it peaked in 1968, about 2.1%, and since then it's dramatically decreased. Okay? The rate of growth. Okay? And that's why we know this is going to level off. And eventually, maybe, if it continues like this, it might stagnate and decline. Okay? So we're now at the rate of population growth, about 1%, that's similar to the first half of the 20th century. So kind of made the curve. We made the turning point. Yeah? We will see later with population. It's actually one of those cases where it's relatively easy to predict the future. It's very slow moving, very good. We're going to see that later. Okay? This we're pretty sure is going to happen. And the other interesting thing is this population growth rate, which was kind of before was almost 0. Right? So population is growing very, 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 very slowly in the first 10,000 years of the present. Extremely slowly, 0.04% per year. And and this really starts to increase. The growth rate of the population starts to increase at about around the 18th century. Okay? We're going to see it's kind of around the time where economic growth also picks up. That's going to be, for the Malthusian theory later on, that's going to be the, remember that, okay? So there are going to be some people who are going to link those two different things. They're going to say, is maybe this takeoff to sustain economic growth related to the takeoff to exponential increase in the population? Okay.
Could you maybe close the other windows?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, where will this population growth take place? And that's where things start to get very interesting, is it's going to occur mostly in what we might call the global south, or the developing world, and there particularly so in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. This will change dramatically the distribution of the world population across regions. So look how it is now, or this is 2019, so before COVID, but it's always the same. At the time there were 7.7 billion people in the world. The biggest region by far was Eastern and Southeast Asia. So look at that kind of China and neighbors, followed by Central and Southern Asia, think of that India and neighbors. Okay? And then kind of 1 billion in Africa, 1 billion in Europe and North America. Yeah? By the end of this century, we're going to have 11 billion people living in the world. Almost 4 billion are going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. It's going to be by far the most populous region in the world. And then followed by Central and Southern Asia, so India and neighbors, China and neighbors, and then Europe and other world. Okay? So we're going to have this shift, this massive shift, where sub-Saharan Africa is by far going to become the most populous region in the world. There are also the one which is still growing, where population growth is still happening at a very fast pace. For the other regions, it's at a very slow pace, or it starts declining by the end of this century, right? Look at Indian neighbors or China neighbors, they will peak around the half of this century, and then will start declining. Okay? Yeah.
So would we say in Eastern and Southeastern Asia, the one-child politics in China was that influential?
I will have a graph. I will have one good point on that, so let's discuss that. That's a good point. Yeah.
How are they monitoring this? So just childbirth rate?
We'll check it out. Yeah. Okay. That's the key part. Interestingly enough, this is going to be a much closer distribution of the world population, how it used to be before the Industrial Revolution and kind of the rise of Europe. Okay? So before that, the world was much more like this, And for example, there's some estimates saying that in sub-Saharan Africa, just the slave trades alone reduced the population by half of what it would have been without the slave trade. Okay? And so this is kind of what looks like overpopulation in sub-Saharan Africa and so on is actually kind of coming closer to the equilibrium the world had before Europe started growing and colonized the rest of the world. Okay, so this is just long perspective on things. Okay. There's another very interesting thing, which is just look at the top 10 of countries with the most population and how that's predicted to change. This would be the situation now. Those already switched. So now it's already India slightly above China, but then kind of US, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, and so on. Russia's still there. And then those arrows will show you how this ranking is going to change until the end of the century. Right? And so you have kind of countries which drop out, which have massive reductions in population. Numbers in relative terms, right? So, for example, Russia is going to drop out of the top 10, Bangladesh, and so on. And then you have the countries which will increase population a lot and become kind of among the top 10 most populous countries, right? So Nigeria, so in the end of the century, Nigeria will have 700 million inhabitants. Then you have countries like Tanzania who will have, will be larger than Brazil is nowadays, for example. Yeah? And those are also very, very interesting. So it's kind of hard to grasp kind of the ideas like the world is going to look very different. Just in terms of like where most people are going to live. Yeah? And it will be kind of much more, here there's basically the US is kind of the only global northwestern country. It's kind of exciting. Everything else is kind of global. Yeah.
When sub-Sahara region is defined, what does it actually mean? Is it sub-Sahara region or is it everything below Sahara?
Yeah, it's a bit, so it's kind of just remove the Muslim majority countries of the northern part. So take Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, out, Libya, and then everything else.
Okay.
That's a good one. And then they call it, and then they kind of, then it kind of matches a bit like this sub-Saharan.
It's not only the belt.
But the belt is inside. Okay. Now just like pure speculation, but you can think of like this is these are kind of predictions. But of course the big unknown is migration, right? That you cannot predict. So this is kind of, so think of it as kind of, there are going to be 700 million Nigerians, but maybe probably they won't all live in Nigeria, right? And so and that will already also give you a sense of maybe where the next, where the kind of pressures for migration might be relocating in the future. Okay, so how is this done? So you can think of population growth as having of a given country or a given well-defined unit in space. There's going to be some natural growth, which is going to be the difference between how many people are born and how many people are dying, and some net international migration, how many people are coming to the country versus how many people are leaving the country. It's kind of just basic accounting of flows, right? So natural growth, you're going to have fertility minus mortality, net international migration, immigration versus out-migration, emigration. Fertility, you usually see kind of a measure that is used is going to be live births per 1,000 population. It's kind of a metric you're going to see in the graphs following. And mortality usually has the same unit. It's going to be now deaths per 1,000 population. Okay? That's usually kind of it. In a given year, how many births of babies which are alive, so also kind of, what is the English term? Babies which die in the process of birth or which are already dead before don't count. And how many people die in a given year versus the per 1,000 population. Now another thing you're going to see very often is this total fertility rate. And that's a bit special, so let's take a minute to see how that's constructed. Because there the idea is kind of, at a given point in time, what you do is you sum up the fertility rate of women in different age groups. Okay? So say, I don't know, today in Gambia, women of ages 15 to 19 have a certain fertility rate that you know because you know who's giving birth and who those mothers are. And then you know the fertility rate of the population, I don't know, 20 to 25, 25 to 30, and so on and so forth. Right? And then what this total fertility rate is going to be in Ghana today, 2025, the sum of all those age-specific fertility rates. Okay? And so that might be, I don't know, 4 or 3 or 3.5, a number like that. Okay? And so that number, the way to interpret it is, imagine this kind of weird construct of a statistical woman who in 2025 in Ghana, kind of, you fast forward what her whole reproductive life would be. You know, if this woman in 1 year would go from 15 years old till 45, how many kids would she have? Okay? So that's really, it's kind of only a snapshot in time. Yeah? Okay, so you're going to see that the number. Okay. That's this TTFR. It's a bit, because this, yeah, it's kind of, this is a construction, right? Okay, so natural growth. And this will show you kind of how do we know, how can we make those predictions? Those things are very slow moving, and so you know pretty well what's going to happen. So everything with like dashed lines, that's just a projection. Everything with the field lines are real data. And so what's going to happen more or less is growths are still going to rise a bit, and they will stagnate, and then population growth is going to reduce a lot because deaths are going to increase a lot. And that's simply because people are getting older. Okay? So as people get older, they're going to start dying much more. And at some point, this is going to catch up with births, and we're going to have this stable population. It's around 11 people by the end of this year. Okay? And then kind of we don't know what will happen, but kind of until here it's pretty sure, unless there's some catastrophic event that changes it. Okay? But even COVID is going to be kind of an uptick here at some point, but nothing, it doesn't change the overall conclusion. Yeah. And those are kind of the broad numbers if you want to think about this. At the moment it's about 50 to 60 million deaths every year. There are, I don't know, 130 million births every year. Okay? And so it's clear that population is still growing. Okay? Right? It's going to reduce a lot. The growth is going to reduce a lot. Yeah.
This is for the sub-Saharan African region or for what region is this?
This is for the whole world. Yeah. For sub-Saharan region, it's going to be more like this. Births are still going to rise more, and deaths are going to increase much more slowly because they are much younger population. Okay. And so it's kind of the same process, but much more delayed. But this is for the whole world. Okay. Now let's look at the different ingredients. So let's start with births. So the key point here is that this total fertility rate is declining very, very, very fast. Okay. So what you have here is kind of the total fertility rate for the world for different years. And so you have, for example, from 1950 to 1955, that's the red line. The average global fertility rate was, or total fertility rate was 5 births. So that would become this. If you took a snapshot in this one period of time, on average, a woman who would complete her reproductive life in this 1 year would have on average 5 kids. Yeah. And you see there was already a huge distribution, variation around that. In Rwanda was 8 kids. In Luxembourg was already 2 in 1950. Yeah? This gives kind of this distribution. And then what you see is as time goes on, everywhere, this is declining. Right? Across the board. And becoming much more equal as well. So now, 2005, 2010, the global average total fertility rate is 2.5. So very, very close to replacement levels. Should be 2.1. Okay? And then this will be the replacement fertility. And what you see is 50% of the world population is already below the replacement level. still will see a lot of fast population growth happening because fertility rates are still relatively high, though very sub-Saharan. Okay. And then for kind of those countries, it's going to stabilize or decline. Okay. Okay. I think the lowest is nowadays is South Korea, which is kind of 0.7, 0.8. Okay, now here's the key, maybe the key concept to understand this. It's about population momentum. If you think of the number of births that are actually happening at every point in time, this is kind of a combination of two things. How many kids on average women have versus how many women are of reproductive age at a certain moment. How big is the cohort of potential mothers, and how many kids on average is each mother having. We usually focus on this and tend to forget the second part. Okay? And this second part is very slow moving. And that's why we are pretty sure we can predict the future very well. Okay? Because you know this from, right? You know the number of births every given year, so you can predict very, very easily, okay, how many women are going to be in this reproductive age in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Because I know how many women are born every year. So I can predict very well the size of this potential mother cohort. And then because total fertility rate declines kind of in a predictable way in small steps, I can have a pretty good idea of this. Right? So this I know almost for sure. This I have a pretty good estimate. So I have a pretty good estimate of the births for the next 50 years for each year. Okay. The second point is the momentum really comes from this second part. And the momentum is this idea that maybe show this first. The momentum is this idea that although the growth rate is declining and fertility rates are declining, population is still increasing a lot. Okay? And why? Because you still have large cohorts of women in the reproductive age. Okay? So the way to think about this is high fertility rates in the past create nowadays a high number of potential adult mothers. Even if each one of them has a lower fertility rate, there are still many of them. Okay? And so that creates this momentum. Although fertility rates are declining, population can still increase a lot because we are going through this cohort of large number of mothers because population growth was so high in the past. Yeah? And many babies were born in the past which are now reaching the age of having kids themselves. Yeah? And this creates this momentum. Right? So it's very difficult to it's kind of, those things are very slow and evolve in a very predictable way because of this, those things are very slow moving. And in the other direction as well, when the population will stop, when growth will decline a lot, like nowadays where we have very low fertility rates, that means there are relatively fewer kids who are going to be born. There are going to be relatively few, in 20, 25 years, 30 years from now, relatively few potential mothers. And so even if you get fertility rates to be very high back then, population might still fall a bit because there's just very few potential mothers. Okay, so this momentum works in both directions, upwards and downwards. Yeah? And it's really kind of, the key thing is the second part. The second part of the cohort. Is this clear? Does it make sense? Okay, so here's kind of a picture that shows that. So here's kind of the age structure of the global population across time, where time is identified by different colors. And so think of 1950s, this very dark blue, purple, something like that. We have this kind of the classical triangle or pyramid, right? So they're very young, it's a very young structure. Most people in the world are very young, as you increase the age, there are fewer and fewer people, and there are very few people working. And it's kind of its classical pyramid. And then what you have to think is, as time goes by, this massive cohort is reaching the age, it's becoming older, right? And so this starts to become more like an onion. You see? So those who were 0 in 1950 are going to be 10 in 1960, are going to be 20 in 1970, so they are going to start having kids, right? And even if they only have much fewer kids than their parents or grandparents' generation, there's still a lot of them. There are many more than their parents were, okay? And so population still continues to increase, even if every single woman of this cohort has fewer kids on average. That's this momentum, okay? And you can see here the projections. At some point, this cohort is going to grow older than classical reproductive age. They're going to become 50, 60, and so on. At that point, this momentum is going to be lost. Okay, that's how we know this is going to stabilize. Okay, so think, for example, in 2100, then this really looks kind of this onion shape. Right? We're very far away from the pyramid. The bulk of the population is going to be. So you can see here, you cannot see, but maybe the size. The median age in 2000, the end of this century is going to be 42 years old. Median age meaning half of the population is going to be below 41 years old, half of the population is going to be older than that. Okay? And that's just how we know that deaths are going to increase a lot. Because you're going to have a massive cohort who's going to reach 80, 85, 90, and you know it will start there. Yeah?
You know why? Like, is it like why were there so many young people in 1950?
Well, yeah, sure. Fertility rates were very high. Right? So fertility rates were very high back then. So imagine if every woman has, so 1915, on average every woman has 5 kids, right? So then imagine the women in 1950 are somewhere here between 20 and 30. They have each has 5 kids, so this cohort is 5 times larger than the cohort of the parents. Right?
So nowadays there are many more old people, not only in Germany but in the whole world.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm interested. What's the range for the woman in the reproductive age? What's an age limit?
I would avoid like
Okay.
it might increase a
Just-
bit.
just
Just like
okay.
yeah, let's say I don't know, from 18 to 45, let's say, or 18 to 52. So of course, what is happening is also women are having fewer kids and also later in life, and so kind of everything is delayed and postponed a bit. So there are also many more women having kids much later, at ages which didn't happen before, and so it might be that kind of the reproductive age is also being a bit expanded, but those are kind of marginal things. Yeah? So here again, like the orders of magnitude are so big that kind of you can be confident in the trend, but of course, if the population is going to be 10.875 billion or 11 or 10.7, that's irrelevant, right? And all these kind of small things might matter for the exact number, but this is the direction, this is kind of the order of magnitude you can expect. Okay? Any more questions? Okay. So then, let's look at kind of more or less how that happened, and how did we get to this gap. And that's basically the study of the so-called demographic transition. Okay? Here's kind of a very stylized model of it. which divides the demographic transition into 4 stages, and then there's kind of a future stage that we might talk again. It's kind of relatively simple, and then you will see it matches pretty well the data we have historically. So at the beginning, and when population growth was very low, this was because birth rates were very high and death rates were very high. Okay, remember the graph that I showed you that in 1950, 30% of all kids born in Africa will not reach the age of 5. And so you might have a lot of kids being born, at the same time you also have a lot of death rates with very young ages. Okay? And so if that's the case, the population is not growing much. Yeah? We're kind of stuck in this. A lot of people are being born, a lot of people are dying at the same time, so it's a stable thing. And what happened historically, almost everywhere, is death rates start falling very fast. Okay? And usually it's because vaccinations were introduced, or sanitation gets improved, or healthcare gets improved, or a country starts the process of economic growth well. Right? Nutrition improves, there's less poverty, and so on. So death rates decline. And birth rates at the beginning are relatively persistent. Okay? And so the second, and here you have the kind of the structure of the age structure of the population. Right? So here, birth rates are very high, death rates are very high, meaning you have a lot of people who are born, but there are a lot of people who die, so very few actually reach old age. Yeah? So the population is very young now. Then in this period, and here you have kind of the total population, here it really grows very fast, right? Because many people are born, but now fewer die. Okay? So this is the period where population growth is really high. Then at some point, birth rates start falling again. Or start falling. And but you still have this gap, which is, all this is kind of new population being added. And then stage 4, where we are at the moment, is birth rates and death rates are again close to each other, but not both very low. So populations are or won't grow much. Yeah? And then stage, and then you have this Swannian age structure of the population. Right? And then kind of this, what we don't know is what will happen in the next stage. It's kind of unknown. Okay, so this is kind of the stylized model. And now we can see how well that's described.
Do you know a reason why birth rates are falling and death rates are falling, like with this gap, but still they are falling when the death rate is falling? You know that?
Yeah. So why will they start falling here, for example?
Yeah.
So then there you have kind of theories of why do people want to have kids, or why do they have kids even if they don't want to. And then you think of many things. So one is, the same kind of things that, for example, in the better medical care and so on, that lead to a lower death rate, might also lead to a better reproductive health and more contraception and things like that. The other thing is, if you think of kids as old age insurance, yeah, as kind of social security systems are expanded and countries grow, maybe that's reason to have kids declines. There's kind of research showing that that's really true. When people get access to pension, or when access to pensions is expanded, people have less kids. And one interpretation, that's kind of a empirical fact. One interpretation is kids' old age insurance, this motive declines. And the second reason, maybe the most important, is less kids are dying at young ages. And so imagine kind of, sounds a bit gruesome, sorry. I guess that's really the decisions people are making, right? If you want to have 2 or 3 kids as your optimal family size, but then 30% of them don't reach the age of 5, then you need to have 4 or 6 births to achieve those 2 or 3 that survive. Yeah? And so if death rates decline, people start to realize, now I adjust this population, right? Now I need 1 or 2 births, I have 1 or 2 kids that reach adult. And before I had 7 actually. Yeah. And then of course, eventually, the population also starts to get older, right? So you have less mobility. Okay, so here's England and Sweden. And England and France are probably, as far as we know, kind of the first countries which go through this process of demographic transition. So if you focus on the English case, but in the Swedish you also see the English case is kind of the nicest one. To see those stages, it matches very well the data. Right? So we have England in the 16th and 17th century, birth rates in blue, death rates in red. You have this phase 1, where both are very high. The population is not growing much. Right? And then what happens is that death rate starts falling much. So around the time where the Industrial Revolution happens, that's what's interesting. The birth rates at first doesn't really move. Anything that goes up, it's kind of stable. And then the birth rates start. And so this is the period where there's a lot of population growth. And then nowadays, they're both very low. Yeah? And in Sweden, you see the same thing. High, death rates start falling, birth rates start falling, low. Now, this declining birth rate in England, this goes in this graph relatively fast, right? You look at it from the middle of the 18th century till the beginning of the 20th, this kind of plot. It's a very, very fast decline, right? What is interesting is this is extremely slow decline. So the type of fertility transitions that countries in the global south are going through or went through in the 20th century is 2-3 times faster than that. So let me show you that graph. So this tells you the number of years it took till the total fertility rate went from 6 to 3. Okay? So in England, that happened in the period 1850-1910. That's exactly this period, right? Where this looks like a massive decline. So if you measure it in years, that took 95 years to go from 6 to 3 children. In Iran and China and South Korea, it took 10, 20 years. Okay. So the speed with this is happening, it's much, much, much faster than kind of the historical experience of countries in Europe and the US and so on. Okay. And now that one-child policy. In China, this very, very fast decline, right? In 11 years, total fertility rates went from 6 to 3. This all happened before the one-child policy was introduced. Okay? And so there's kind of this debate whether, of course it contributed to low fertility in China, but it's probably not the key factor. Right? It was already just got the fast process we know together with Iran. Right? They needed 11 years to transition to close to a century in the US and in the UK. Yeah?
Do you know why Iran only had this shift so late? Like, that was after the Islamic Revolution.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it was a pretty advanced country before 1978.
Yeah. So, like, of course, this is kind of the. So like this, those years, this kind of 6 to 3 is just to compare kind of the same process everywhere. But of course, fertility rates were declining before and were declining after in Iran. And this is kind of just picking that moment in time where they went from 6 to 3. And that was this decade. But of course, before they went from 8 to 6, and then after that they now are below replacement level. So they're now below 2 as well. Okay. So this was much, much faster. think of this process again, and then you will notice there is this period where this is happening, where the age structure of the population is increasing at the bottom. Right? At the beginning, the bottom is becoming kind of chubbish, right? Here. And so there's a moment where these big cohorts don't die so often. And so finally you have massive cohorts which reach the adult age, here. So you have this what is called the demographic dividend, which is a period in this transition where relatively high cohorts of people in working age relative to young and old. Okay. So that will become a baby boomers in Germany in the 60s, that's a good example, right? And then eventually those will grow older and retire, and then demographic dividends and so on. And the idea of the demographic dividend is there's this couple of decades where basically kind of the structure of your population is such that you might expect a large economic growth. If a country finds a way of putting those people into collective employment and so on, because you have these kind of large numbers of people in working age relative to the very few elder and relatively fewer kids. Okay? And as they grow older, this dividend is over, and then eventually becomes kind of a curse. Okay, and so that's a bit what Sub-Saharan Africa is going through now. Okay, so there's kind of if you look at kind of discussions on development in Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, it is a lot of like youth employment, jobs of the future and so on, because there's this kind of sense of urgency, that kind of now 20, 30, 40 years, in which Africa is going to have this optimal age structure with a lot of young people, relatively few elderly, but then if you wait like 50, 60 years, it won't be that easy. And kind of China, India, they are already over this period. And then the discussions are now increasing fertility rates, what do we do with the pension system and so on. Very similar discussions that we have here. Okay, is this clear? Right, so working age people are those who are working a lot, those are the ones who are saving a lot, or consuming a lot, those are kind of all kind of probably the age groups which contribute the most to economic growth and development, etc. Okay. Any questions? Oh, we check. Okay. And the Malthusian tribe. So imagine the demographic transition would explain kind of why that happens, right? That's kind of the history of the demographic transition. Death rates start falling, population growth increases, fertility rates take some while to adjust, but eventually they also decline, and the population growth goes up. Okay? So that's kind of, we understand that process fairly well. What about this? Okay. What about this part? These thousands of years where this did not happen is extremely low. How do we understand kind of this stage one? What's going on there? And that's the Malthusian tribe. That's what the Malthusian tribe helps us to explain. How do we understand this? Okay. So it's called Malthusian because the guy who wrote it, this very famous book, Putting Forward This Theory, was Thomas Malthus. You heard of Thomas Malthus before? It's Malthusian ideas. theological aspects to this, but he makes and he's kind of the father of demography, if you want. So he writes this book, An Essay on the Principle of Population, in 1798. You're going to see kind of the year or the period where he writes it, kind of ironic at the end. And he has this very simple but powerful explanation for why we are stuck in this world of high growth rates, high death rates, and we will never get out of it. So he claims, he's writing and claims, well, of the main economic activity and what essentially determines how many people you can have at your population maximum is how much food, how much agricultural output you can produce to feed them. And he's still writing kind of pre-industrial revolution type of world where kind of agriculture is what matters. For population growth, what matters is how much food you have. And then he claims, well, there's a fixed quantity of land you can use for farming, and you start by cultivating the land which is most productive, for obvious purposes. And so as you expand more and more your agricultural frontier, the quality of land starts increasing. Right? So you start with the most productive land, and then if you need more and more, you start moving into areas where agriculture is not so productive. Okay? And so if land expands, there are going to be decreasing marginal returns to additional land. Yeah? Okay. So then if you put those two together, if population starts growing, you need more land to produce more food for them, but the extra land you start farming on is going to be of lower quality. So then the average food production per capita is going to go down. And so there's kind of this mechanical relationship. If population growth grows, necessarily kind of per capita income will go down. Right? In this world, per capita food production goes down. Population increases, you expand land that lands of low quality, necessarily everyone gets less. The second, so this is kind of from population to growth, more or less. And then to complete the model, it's all, there's no math, so I really can think of it as really kind of like it's a well-constructed model. There's the other feedback loop. Many times, if food production increases or per capita income increases, for whatever reason, we're going to discuss that later, but imagine someone invents a great agricultural machine that produces more food. There's a new plow or whatever. If this goes up, then he claims that people will react by having more kids. Okay. If incomes go up, people will just have more kids. Okay, they will marry earlier, they will have more resources to spend on their kids, whatever. Okay, but that's kind of a crucial assumption he makes. And if incomes go up, mortality also goes down. Because there's less poverty, there's more food available. Okay? And so fertility goes up and mortality goes down, you get more population. And then you see the trend. If you put those things together, there's this trend. Right? Population increases, incomes go down. Income increases, population increases. But if population increases, incomes go down. You are trapped in this vicious cycle. There's no escape. That's the model in track.
But isn't that completely disproven?
Yes.
Okay.
So the cool thing is that is a great explanation for this first stage. So from the world from 10,000 years ago until 17. And so that's the ironic part, right? He writes at the moment where the UK is escaping the Malthus trap. Right? But of course he's writing, he's unaware that this is happening. He's writing kind of looking back at his experience and history, and he says that the world is like this, and exactly at that moment, there's the escape, there's the demographic transition, which breaks that. But what is interesting is, these are very popular ideas still. So there's this famous Club of Rome, report in the 1960s. Then there's one of those books, the population time bomb, and so on. This idea that through the fertility rate we see in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we're going to run out of food, and we want to be able to feed all these people, and what should we do, and so on. And that's clearly Malthusian. That's sometimes called neo-Malthusian thinking. And this idea that there's this trap. And this idea that if population increases a lot, we just don't want. We're going to run out of resources. Yeah? You also find it in some climate debates. And so although it was distorted in the way it puts it, it's a very, you'll see this type of argument, this type of trap, where you're thinking still helping. So I think it's important to and again, it fits very well the world that he knew before. Okay? So the thing it doesn't explain is, or the thing you cannot explain is how we break out of the trap. But kind of the trap was there historically. Yeah? And the thing which breaks out of the trap is this link gets broken. Okay? Kind of the Industrial Revolution and increases in technology break this link. You have the Industrial Revolution is basically a period where population is increasing a lot, and per capita income is also increasing a lot. So that's the way. Okay. So then you kind of are going to have fluctuations, but kind of on average, you're going to be stuck in this equilibrium where population and income are fixed. And you're going to be fixed at the subsistence level. Okay? You're going to be fixed at kind of the level of per capita income where basically everyone has just enough to survive. Because everything above that will make people have more kids, lower death rates, this will increase population, and population will reduce income. You're back on track. Okay? And again, that's a pretty good description of the world from 10,000 till 750 in England at least, and later in other places where you have these fluctuations of living standards, but around kind of a flat trend around the subsistence level. Okay. Yeah, and it has some kind of this reasons why. So if you have kind of an equilibrium, what are the forces bringing you always back to the equilibrium? And then it has these famous positive and negative checks. And the idea is, imagine the population increases, then it tells you, well, then income per capita is going to decline. As soon as this declines below the subsistence level, then, you know, all sorts of bad things start happening. You get more diseases, you get famines, maybe people start fighting over scarce resources and you get wars, and all those things then bring population again back. When population goes back, then per capita incomes go again back to equilibrium. Yeah? And so they fluctuate over time. There might be long cycles, but you can say there are always kind of those forces which will bring you back to the subsistence level. And that's kind of for Britain, where we have the best and longest, more frequent time series for this, you see kind of population in blue, real wages as a measure of living standards in yellow, and then you see when Malthus is writing this book, or when he publishes it, and Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations, and kind of when he's writing kind of about this period, which is kind of, I would say it's consistent with the Malthusian trap at least. The kind of living standards around subsistence, some variation, population growth, very zero, more or less, straight line, right? And then the kind of the ironic thing is, at the time he's writing, it's a time when physics for the first time we both increase exponentially. Yeah? Okay. situation where in equilibrium, where the population is constant and everyone's income is constant at the subsistence level. Then imagine there's an improvement in technology, and someone invents a new way of rotating the crops, like in Middle Europe, which is more efficient. Or someone invents a new plow, which is more efficient, whatever. And the first thing is, on average, incomes go up, incomes per farmer go up. As farmers get richer, the population rises, because few people are dead, more people get born. As population rises, there's less land for farmer. The farmers have to move to lower quality lands on average. Then the average output per farmer will start falling. Farmers' income will fall. As farmers' income will fall, the population eventually will start falling because death rates will become larger and birth rates decrease. And you end up again back into the initial. That's kind of the logic. Yeah, and the way out of it is breaking this link of it is not always the case. Through technological progress, it's no longer true that higher population leads to lower. This link is true. And so you have a situation where population is rising and at the same time average is one part. And the other part is this idea that higher incomes always lead to higher fertility is also not always true. And so there are other ways of so-called preventive checks. There are other ways of birth control that people might put in place when times are hard. So you have things like people get married later, fewer kids on average, and so on and so forth. And so this kind of that was that's maybe where training as a priest was maybe a bit too strong, right? They always claims if there are more resources available, the natural response of people is just go and have more kids and reproduce themselves and higher rates. Okay? That's of course historically not always true. Okay? Yeah, and you can think of those two things kind of. Again, this autism chart being broken in a very specific time period, in a very specific region first. So Northwestern Europe, of this breaking the link between population growth and lower per capita incomes is being kind of the first time that happens in a sustained way is during the first industrial revolution in England, which then spreads across other countries. And this idea that higher incomes always lead to higher fertility was being broken by the beginning of the fertility transition, which were the first countries actually France, but more or less around the same time, a bit later. But again, that's kind of either when he's writing or immediately after, so it's not yet. He's being disproven by reality as he's writing. That's the irony. Okay, let's just again show you. Those two things are the timing of the demographic transition and the timing of this rising wages rising population are very match very well. So there's one group of economists who claim that's the explanation for this. There's one group of economists that say the reason for the Industrial Revolution and the takeoff to sustain economic growth is the demographic transition. And the explanation why other countries didn't go for that process yet or very late is because they had the demographic transition very late. Okay. So I'm not entirely convinced by this argument, but there's one argument put out there where they leave those two things in a causal way. Say this causes this. less kids die less, and people start investing in more in the human capital of each child, and so on and so forth. The education starts rising at least. The women try the labor market, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So they link the demographic growth to the Industrial Revolution. They say the demographic growth is the cause of the Industrial Revolution. Okay.
Exactly. And it's kind of, I don't fully agree with that view, but this shows you why it's this kind of, it's another suspect was in the scene of the crime at the same time as the confess. Right? That's that one. And then of course there's the temptation to say, okay, are they really? Okay, then one last thing, and then we can. Any questions on this? And one last thought before I let you go. Do you know this way of, are you familiar with this way of representing the world? Yeah. So the world is this, so the world is flat, of course. And so when you want to represent this kind of strange sphere with kind of so that it kind of squeezed at the tops, right? The North Pole and the Solar Pole are a bit squeezed, as kind of this weird shape, which is three-dimensional. You want to represent it in a map, which is two-dimensional. You need to make choices how to project this three-dimensional surface into a two-dimensional map. Basically, with infinite ways of doing that, right? And at the end, it's all about, or what that will have implications on is how the size of the things, of the areas in the map relate to their real size in this sphere that is the world. Okay? That's what those different projections have different implications for that. And this, the Mercator projection, is very famous. It's the name might say it is by Mercator, is a geographer. And it has this, what you might feel like this is a classic one, maybe the one you would draw if I ask you to. And the line that is, this is the projection which puts Europe at the center. Okay? That's why. That's the kind of the way he drew it was, I want to create kind of a good, accurate representation of the world as a two-dimensional space where Europe is at the center. And that's what comes out. Okay? That has the implication that if you make Europe the center, Europe is going to look larger. Right? So if Europe is the center, then the rest of the world becomes spread out away. And so Europe will look in the map larger than it is in reality. Okay? So an indication. And so there's a Japanese cartographer who made a different map of the world and a different projection, Narukawa. And there his purpose, just like Mercator's purpose, was that Europe appears in the center, as the center of the world. His purpose was, I want to draw a projection which best represents, in two dimensions, the actual size of each country, or of the land mass that it has in reality. And that's what comes out. Okay, now the center is kind of, so you see it's much more about spreading it in a, it's not focusing on any region, it's trying to spread equally. And what is the main difference that you see? Compared to this one?
For me, it's green and it's so much smaller than compared to the other one. Also, Europe, of course, and especially Russia is smaller. Seems to be smaller, of course, it's the biggest.
The distortion happens mostly over sea where there's nothing, and so you can present more close to how they really are.
Yeah, it's probably the Mercator projection is the farther you go to the north or to the south from the equator, the more wrong is, or the larger is the size of 1 square kilometer.
So in the right in the sense of closer to the actual, just from this perspective of areas being closer to their real size, what are the areas that become much larger? Or what are the areas which are much smaller in Mercato than they should be? Just kind of the most striking ones.
For me, it's Africa
Mhm.
and South America also.
Look here. Africa is just kind of maybe a bit larger than Europe, and here you see the real change in size, the real relation, right? And then things like Australia, which again, like the ones which are very long, Australia, also Latin America, like Brazil, Mexico, much larger.
But of course, it's still wrong, no? Because you cannot have a globe
Yeah,
on,
exactly.
also now the oceans are too large. No?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Of course. So it's all. So, yeah. Of course. You'll never, because it's impossible. It's a two-dimensional model of three-dimensional space. So you'll never. But this is kind of the one that gets closer to the actual proportions of those areas. Yeah.
But there was a reason why Mercator projected this. It was Europe, of course, was a center, but it has had advantages because for sailors going from Europe to Latin America and to other countries, it's much easier to navigate this Mercator projection.
Yeah, totally. So I'm not saying it was and it's also kind of he made it so it's obvious that he put his home at the center, right? So like it was also kind of a political, geographical, scientific document made by Europeans for Europeans. So of course, I'm not saying this was kind of a propaganda-ish map. I'm just saying it's interesting, like it became kind of the standard way of representing the world. And I just want to show you that there's an implicit bias inside.
Maybe only one additional note. It's really interesting because it's a time when the colonial time it was not possible to determine the Breitengrad. I don't know the English. What is it?
Latitude.
So the latitude was not possible actually. And with Mercator projection, that was a solution more or less. You could have a straight line, and you are always right with the sun and the moon.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But like with this map, then if I now tell you by the end of the century, the region with the most population is going to be sub-Saharan Africa. Sure, right? Plus, what I say. And if you look at here, Europe is just a small peninsula of Asia. That's where we are. And that's very obvious, right? So I think it's interesting. Okay. Yeah, there's no other question about any other.
I have one question. When we spoke about how large should the regional population number in 10 years, it was like this 1+ net migration. How do we know it?
Yeah, we don't really know. So there's some projections. So for example, here, when you look at those top 10 countries, so kind of at the global level, we know because there's no maybe Elon Musk finally colonizes Mars and leaves to get some people with, but until then we don't have migration. But yeah, here for example, so why did the United States are projected to increase population a lot? A lot is kind of just projecting current migration patterns into the future, and that's one of the part which is more likely to change, maybe. So yeah, that's the part we don't really. We can kind of see where migration pressures might be coming from, right? So look at kind of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a place with extremely poor, living in civil conflict. They will increase population by 67 million to 362 million by the end of the century, unless this country radically transforms. it's very likely that a lot of those people will migrate somewhere. And so you can kind of see a bit what might be. Okay, if not, for the ones who are right late, so there are three assignments left. One take-home assignment will be over the Christmas break. I will announce it next class. I will also write it on Blackboard, so it's one that you can fully do remote. It's going to be easy, so that's a Christmas gift. And then the other two in-class assignments, which I read, are going to be the first week of next year, 7th of January, and the week after, 14th of January, in class. And we're going to do class work, group work, to plan the lecture, the open lecture of February 3rd. Okay?